Welcome to the Engaged Jain Studies Podcast, brought to you by Arihanta Institute. Listen to top figures in the fields of Jain studies, religious studies, vegan studies, and social justice discuss pressing issues of everyday relevance. Together, let's move beyond the realm of personal spiritual growth and connect philosophy, religion, and spirituality to the important task of caring for the well-being of society. Learn about your world and how to change it on the Engaged Jain Studies Podcast.
So hello and welcome to the Engaged Jain Studies Podcast. My name is Jonathan Dickstein. I am a professor with Arihanta Institute, focused on religion and animals, religion and veganism, Jain studies, and other topics. I will be your host for today's episode. And I am extremely happy and extremely privileged to introduce our guest, Christopher Sebastian. Thank you for being here with us.
Thank you so much. I am extremely happy and extremely privileged to be here.
Wonderful. So Christopher is a journalist, technical writer, and adjunct lecturer. He teaches in the School of Journalism, Media, and Visual Arts at Anglo-American University in Prague. He writes about food, politics, media, pop culture, and of course, animals. So I've asked Christopher to be here today because not only do I find that his work is extremely relevant to vegan studies, and as some of you may know, I kind of lead the Vegan Studies Initiative and program at Arihanta Institute, but also because Christopher will be teaching a course for us upcoming at the very end of March, Veganism in Pop Culture. And so for both of these reasons, one is giving kind of a glimpse into this upcoming course, but also because having followed Christopher's work for many years and being in kind of dialogue over those years, I find that it's just like such a needed and specific and unique perspective. And I'm extremely happy to bring that to our audience at Arihanta and outside of the Arihanta community. So to get started, Christopher, so I like to ask folks that come on the podcast, at least when I'm hosting, is how did kind of the issues, maybe not even veganism, but just about animals get on your radar? Or more specifically, given the mainstream perspectives regarding animals, how did you get, quote unquote, radicalized for animals in the first place?
Yeah, that's a fun story. I actually went vegan in 2004. And so I guess depending on how you interpret radicalization, you could say that it was a book. It was media that had done it to me because I read the book Skinny Bitch, which was marketed mostly as a diet book written by two white women, which is not it wasn't a very feminist introduction to veganism, as I frequently say. It starts out like the first couple of chapters, maybe like 3 chapters. It's very like diet focused. And then it takes like a hard left turn into animal exploitation and like animal farming and slaughterhouses. And it was an immediate response for me to just say, oh, that's it then. And I know that loads of people take more gradual steps, but impulsive person that I am, I did not do this halfway. I immediately leapt into it. And and I had been vegan ever since. But if you talk about radical in the more political sense, the way that I think about being radical, it wasn't for nearly a decade later until I read The Sexual Politics of Meat by Carol Adams, which for the uninitiated, is a very feminist critique, feminist, vegan, vegetarian critique of our culture and masculinity and the patriarchal relationship with animal exploitation and meat eating and violence. And that was revolutionary. That was my big awakening moment. And ironically, or perhaps not so, there's actually a chapter in there which had sown the seeds as well for my exploration of media, because she had written a chapter about Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. And in that chapter, which of course I'm assuming you know all about, she explores the vegetarianism of Frankenstein's monster, which gets lost in a lot of adaptations and interpretations of the original story by Mary Shelley. But like, she was very clear that Frankenstein's monster was vegetarian, and it was one of the ways that he distanced himself or acted in a subversive fashion, like in relationship to like humanity and humans and the evil that humans are capable of, and visit upon other non-human persons every day. And so like that was extremely powerful for me. So like, that was my gateway drug, if you will.
Well, that's fascinating. So I think that's just this very interesting component that I think gets lost, right? Is the presentation, and we'll get to that, of vegetarianism or like vegetarian adjacent, like alt consumption in popular media, in fiction, and so on. I think that's actually kind of like rare in vegan studies and animal studies to focus on. But we'll get like kind of back to that. So actually it's right. It is pretty amazing that in Adams's book, she's talking about this, right? Like kind of that early on. What are we, 30 some years or 30 some years?
Yeah, it's like a good 30 years from the original publication.
Now from the original publication. And so, but I want to go back. So you're saying that in 2004, when you're still just a sprout, you're reading a Skinny Bitch. So how do you even get, like, what about, if you don't mind sharing, what's pre-2004 Christopher kind of brought up in, the kind of environment brought up in? Because this is what I think about a lot. We were kind of joking about this prior to the podcast, which is that this kind of assumption that these kind of vegans, quote unquote, animal lovers or so on, grow up in environments that are just conducive to this. But the more and more you talk to individuals, at least myself too, like it's just something not on the radar for years and years and years. And then somehow slowly or abruptly enters that radar. So how does pre-2004 Christopher operate in the world, and then even come to a place where this book is in their hands?
Very typically. I was operating very typically, my friend. I was out there eating all the McDonald's and Burger King, and like, and questioning like veganism and vegetarianism, and like, like with disdain, and like, that doesn't seem right, or like, I don't know what those people are doing, or why would you not want to eat all of these delicious things? And fried chicken is food. So like that's like, I never thought about it, or I never interrogated my own participation in like animal violence. And insofar as I had considered vegetarianism, never veganism, by the way, but like, it was just like, something to be healthy. It was a health fad. Like, oh, I'm going to like go on this diet to make me feel better, without ever quite understanding why like plant-based food would actually make one feel better than eating animal-based food. That was my life pre-2004.
Yeah, I think that's pretty typical. I think it's also this kind of irony that those who end up becoming radicalized or even changing their diet tend to be those who are like the strongest opponents of it prior to that, right?
Always.
Prior to that. And so, that's kind of like fascinating, and it's interesting to come through it from like Skinny Bitch to Adams. It's kind of a very interesting juxtaposition. And, sometimes I think people get to the point where I talk about the radicalization of, say, someone's consciousness for animals, even comes full circle, or folks will say things like, well, it's not radical to be compassionate towards animals. And like, but that's how full circle we've become, where it's as if like, but obviously in the mainstream, talking about the things that you're talking about or others are talking about is certainly radical, is certainly quote unquote weird, atypical, and so on. So getting to that, I mean, I think, right, the construction of what is typical or what is weird and what is radical and what is not is largely a function of media, right? Visual culture, music, film. And, in your course that's coming up, you mentioned Bell Hooks, right? Author, critic, who's talking about how, quote, she found the best way to teach students or individuals about otherness that was by relating it to a medium they were familiar with, the media and popular culture. So can you explain this, particularly in relation to other mediums that are common in, say, animal ethics or vegan studies or discourses about veganism, which is oftentimes philosophy and science? Tell me a bit like how you interpret hooks, why you think that's important, not only for your work, or maybe just kind of understanding the terrain as a whole.
Yeah, so philosophy and science, I don't think are things that people organically engage with in the ways that we would imagine them to do in order to to make connections with like animal lives. Like people feel somewhat disconnected from them, but pop culture is literally, it's pop culture. Like it's popular culture. Like this is this is part of our culture. These are the things that people relate to in the moment, collectively as a society. And like what does that consist of? Like that's movies, that's it's a film, it's television, it's books, it's music, it's all around us. And these things do have a tremendous influence on us. And when I referenced hooks, which there's a lot of like Black feminist thought in my work, and in my understanding of like veganism and media in general, like my introduction to her thoughts around like pop culture were in oh my God, now I'm forgetting it and I'm going to look like an idiot on the podcast. No, it's it's cultural criticism and transformation. It was 1997. And so like it's very, very accessible if anybody goes looking for it. But like that is like, I don't want to say this is her central thesis, but one of the things that had actually leapt out to me is that, she said the movies and media, they act as vehicles of propaganda to maintain the hegemonic order. But also, crucially, they can act in subversive ways as well. And for me, I kind of had the realization that that although I wasn't consciously thinking about veganism or thinking about animals, there was a lot of messaging. There were seeds that were planted along the way in the types of media that I had consumed throughout my entire life. And the things that resonated with me most were always sympathetic to animals. But so you have all of these puzzle pieces, but it's just not, they're not put together for you. And you have to like do that work yourself. And I think that actually helping people to make those connections, writing about it and teaching it in that accessible way does help those synapses form for a lot of people. I would say that the people, most of us, produce cultural identity through our interpretations of the prevailing stories of the time around us. And as such, I look at a lot of the things that I watched growing up, like in the introduction that I filmed, I talk about Fraggle Rock and how someone had asked a question of me very recently, what is your idea? What is your vision of a plant-based future look like? And I'm like, I actually have an answer for that. Although I didn't have it at the time, this is one of those things that you think about later on, when you're in the shower. And it's like, oh, you know what? I should have said this and I didn't. But yeah, when you think about how this children's television series was constructed in the 1980s around this group of of genderless friends that are living in this fictional place, this fictional subterranean place where they subsist on a plant-based diet in this moneyless, peaceful, non-hierarchical society. And I'm like, oh wow, this is this is, and it's all regenerative as well, because all of the characters have these really uniquely interwoven relationships with one another. All of the species that live in this in this universe, and I'm like, that's what I want. That's yeah, holy smokes. And and I don't know whether this was something that Jim Henson had conceived of consciously when he was creating this, and the team of brilliant people that he had around him, but it's there. It's there. And and it gives us a blueprint of what our world can look like. And but of course, everything isn't isn't happy and bright and rainbows like Fraggle Rock is. I personally, my favorite medium of film is horror movies, and there's so much to be said about animal agriculture consumption, especially subgenres of horror, zombie films, where we kind of we can again draw these parallels, these understandings. Like, so there's this huge well to draw from, so big, in fact, that it's hard to narrow down what I want to focus on in the actual class, because like you can go on forever talking about animal animal representations in the media, and like, how it also relates to race, to gender, to class, to sexual orientation, like just all aspects of our identity.
Yes, and I'm not gonna put you on the spot because I'll talk a little bit while I let you think about it, because I really am curious about. Well, I'll mention it first so I can give you time. Is yes, these figures of zombies and vampires, right? They're very specific, right, in what they are. We're talking about horror, so we could talk about that a bit. And it's really about like what it means to be human. What is the most taboo behavior to do? What is the thing that like dehumanizes you the most? And a lot has to do with consumption. So that's the thing I'm going to want you, maybe if you have some examples or things you could like kind of speak to, I think that would be great, because I think it also lends it to what you came to at the very end of your response, which is that, right, the figure of like the animal and how intimately it's related to human consumption has just such, I don't want to say just a flexibility, but just such a broad relevance that it's becomes more and more, I think, the more you get into vegan studies, animal studies, it's just impossible to separate it from these other issues. Like the term doesn't make sense. So we can't talk about animals outside of, say, race and gender and ability. It's just really not possible anymore, because it seems like we can talk about biological animals separately, which is a completely legitimate kind of like valence of that term. But in the valence that matters, it's actually impossible. So, and the last thing I'll say, it's really funny that you mentioned Fraggle Rock as this idyllic society, because I was reminded of where I see the opposite end of that in that quite famous quote by Marx, where he's talking about being able to do different forms of labor. And he's imagining, right, it's kind of like an ideal society, the individual man can, like, quote, hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, and criticize after dinner. And he's right trying to promote this like amazing world in which you can do things at different times. And on the one hand, that's wonderful. But I think someone once said, like, this sounds like an awful world for animals. It's everything what you're doing during the day are just like various ways to exploit and kill animals until you can go home in the evening and engage in critique. So anyway, it was kind of amazing that we could sometimes like elevate, obviously, and rightly so, Marx for other ideas, but on animals, this seems to like portray a pretty awful future world. Right. So coming back to my original question, can you talk a little bit about, maybe with examples or things that you really like to see in horror or other media, about how these representations certainly relate to our relationships to animals, maybe even including human animals?
Yeah, like, so to use examples from horror, obviously we just talked about Frankenstein and the many iterations of Frankenstein, or Frankenstein's monster, I should say, that we have seen in the various retellings, but vampires as well. And I know that Laura Wright is also doing a course, I believe in the fall, for Arihanta as well. And like, I draw a lot of inspiration from her work, and she had written for, I believe, the Vegan Studies Project. She'd written extensively about vampires. In fact, I believe that was like, one of the hooks in one of, in like the early chapters of one of the pieces that I had written from her, or excuse me, read from her, that she had written. And yeah, she had used Twilight as an example. And like, that particular style of vampire, where like the vampire who refrains from consuming human animals is thought to be and I think that Stephanie Meyer, who had written Twilight, had phrased it this way, is more like, think of it like being a vegetarian. So like, if you don't eat humans or drink the blood of humans and you feed instead on animals, that's a lesser form of like a vampirism, or like, a variation of it, where you're seen as more virtuous because you've chosen to to eat other animals than humans. And I think that that's fascinating. And again, I it had triggered synapses in my brain about the early iterations of vampires as like soulless monsters, as we had seen them throughout history, throughout the 1700s and 1800s. And up to, I think, around like the mid 20th century, where you were introduced to the compassionate vampire, I think, in Dark Shadows, which was a soap opera. An afternoon soap opera. Like, just imagine the show that's on opposite days of our lives. And like, as the world turns. And like, I thought that it's brilliant. It had been in syndication by the time I was watching it, I think on like the Sci-Fi Network, some 40 years later, or whatever. But like in the 1960s and 70s, that was like the most popular show on TV. And Barnabas Collins was the quintessential, like he set the blueprint for the compassionate vampire that we're using in Twilight, like 40 years after that. And it's like there's so many connections there. But like, just this thinking about like the villain in so many of our films, like the monster is an animal or some variant of an animal. Everything from Anaconda with like that like god awful film that I love, by the way, with Jennifer Lopez and John Voight. Like everything from that to like Jaws, like shark films, and like it's literally something called Sharknado. Holy smokes! Like there's literally a Jaws effect out there. Like the effect that it has had on sharks. That film from like the 1970s that has like continued to plague the shark's reputation for literally decades, and how it's affected our relationship with aquatic life as a result of it. And even as early as like, the 1930s with the original King Kong, when that had come out, like most people have critiques about King Kong as like an animal, but like, like just like understanding like the cultural, social, and economic circumstances of the United States at the time that film was made, like many of the thought processes that had gone into like crafting this narrative and how that story had originated. So much of how we feel about animals is wrapped up in like in racial animosity as well, and like and like animalized races, as well as like like animals, like races that are like vice versa. I'm sorry, like I'm getting caught up on my words.
Racialized animals.
Racialized animals. Thank you so much. And yeah, like that to me is an example of a film where you see it really, really clearly, because like, white fears and anxieties around like Blackness and particularly Black masculinity, like had inspired a lot of the giant like African ape that is terrorizing white civilization in the West, and like preying on white womanhood in a very like in a very dark and evil, dastardly way. And so like this is rife all through, like for decades and decades. We see like different types of monsters, and monsters that are composed of both human and animal assemblages, like the werewolf. Just like you have these like this very anthropic like animal, like a wolf and human hybrid, that exists at different times and in different ways, that creates fear for a lot of people as well, because we do fear being animalized to some extent, and that's reflected to us in our media and our consumption of it. So yeah, like those are the things that like that kind of like inspired this course, and in many ways inspired my journey.
Yeah, it's extremely rich, and I'm probably going to ask you to speak a little bit more, because I think for a lot of folks in the audience, and I think a lot of people who come into veganism via kind of mainstream kind of outlets, or like vegan outreach, Humane League, Mercy for Animals, things, it's really just, and it's not a critique, it's just very animal centric, right? And when we're talking about, say, race or class issues, it's usually about, say, like labor, which is also a legitimate issue, right? The kind of individuals who are forced to operate in these industries, or the ways in which certain types of animal-based foods are thrown into marginalized communities. But what you're talking about is something more fundamental, and also which really interests me, which is that actually, right, the entire ideas themselves are like at the core of these issues, and especially say with King Kong as an example, right? And we saw everything with like the Harambe Zoo incident, and the way that Claire Kim writes about Harambe, also writes about Michael Vick. And in being in Philadelphia, I kind of know that as well, and you also know Philadelphia well. And I think these are such key topics, because when you realize how much the symbolism shoots through human groups into exactly the racialization of animals, and then into the ways that even translates into food. So not to talk at length, but I remember or an episode before, I was talking with Yamini Narayanan, and we were talking about, like, say, the symbolism of beef in India, and how a lot of resistance to casteism or some forms of Hindu nationalism is for individuals to kind of like eat beef or promote beef as a way to act out a form of solidarity and resistance. And there's a critique against that. But what Yamini said, which I think is extremely instructive even in this case, is the idea that when the dominant culture makes something a symbol of oppression, it's only natural for those to use that same symbol to fight back against that symbol in resistance.
Yeah.
And so I was just like imagining the ways in which veganism tries to get groups that have been animalized to change their behaviors, change their foods, that have already been racialized, but without understanding that those groups themselves might not be absolutely wedded to the food as food, but they need that food to fight back as a symbol.
Yeah, this is like what you're talking about. Like, I can't think of a clearer example off the top of my head right now than this book called Building Houses Out of Chicken Legs.
Yeah, my students read that recently. It's wonderful.
Stop playing.
Yeah, no,
yeah, no, like Psyche Wilson Ford or Ford
Wilson Forson.
Yeah,
yes,
Wilson Forson. Yeah, I can only describe that book as gripping. Like, you know, as a historian, the labor that she put into writing that book, like the love and attention that she poured into it, is there on every page. And I think that it's such an important book for people who are involved in animal rights, veganism, animal liberation, to read and not just comprehend, but internalize, like emotionally internalize. Because it is like the clearest example of, like, you know, of how food represents so much more than something that we consume to keep our bodies alive. Like, when, like, particularly white activists are talking about, like, chicken and, like, you know, the relationship that the Black community in the United States in particular has with chicken, they don't really get that. They don't really get that. They don't get the understanding, the historical understanding of this. They don't get that, like, that the fried chicken is symbolic of our identity as Black people. And, like, they only see Black people herding chickens through their consumption habits, and not understanding that, like, you know, this is tied up in the history and the legacy of slavery in the United States. Back in the 16 and 1700s, chickens were not considered to be actual meat fit for consumption by white people, by the white man in particular. They weren't even counted as part of inventory. And as such, that was like the only meat protein that many Black people had access to. And like the style of cooking fried chicken, like, you know, that has a lot of historical, like, meaning for us as Black people as well. And like, so like when you look at this through that historical lens and understand that, like, you know, a chicken leg, a drumstick is not merely a drumstick. And it's also not just like this fragmented part of an animal's body, but it represents like something that has sustained Black people. And it makes me sad. It really makes me sad for a number of reasons, because like in my thesis, I had written about like animal symbolism in US political discourse, and how actors on the far right actually use animal exploitation as like some symbols of white supremacy, thinking about things like milk and like, you know, and dairy, and how like people of Northern European heritage are commonly thought to be able to consume like lactose in ways that other people like around the world cannot, people who are part of the global majority. How beef is synonymous with like, you know, American white male Christian identity, because so much of the cattle beef complex is wrapped up in the genocide of Native Americans and the westward expansion of European settlers. And like, you know, but then the other side of that, the other very dark side is that like there is a lot of animal consumption that's wrapped up in Black nationalism as well. And I want to be clear that I'm not talking about Black nationalism as something that is like, you know, synonymous with white nationalism, but like rather like, you know, the commonly understood idea of like, you know, the right to Black self-determination, and just defining nationalism like that. So many people in my community, as like the American descendants of slavery, look at veganism as something that is part of like white culture, that is like about purity. It's associated with eating disorders and orthorexia. And so like consuming animal products when viewed through that frame is liberatory, which is an absurdity to me. Like that's like, because what we're effectively saying is that we're building our liberation on the backs of other bodies that don't belong to us, which in my opinion reinforces the hegemony, the hierarchy, and is like, you know, it's rife with violence. And like, and so many Black people view our liberation as having access to the things that white people have, whether it is fur coats, whether it is like, you know, like a steak dinner, whether it is, it's all about being able to consume in the ways that we have historically been denied by white people. And, you know, and we see that again reinforced through our media and representations of us through media that in many cases we largely don't even control. And we just repeat those cycles of violence. I'm sorry, that was a very long answer, but
No, it's wonderful.
I'm not even sure I answered the question anymore. But
no,
like,
I think you did, and I'm a bit of a broken record. I really love to repeat what Vasile Stanescu says a lot, amongst other brilliant things, is, and this might lead to another question about kind of the general environment around veganism and animals and so on, which is that start off from the point understanding that we're all victims when it comes to animals, like in our understanding of animals and what we consume and how we consume, which is, it's not like this kind of obviously removal of responsibility. It's just that the way you were brought up, behave, especially with respect to animals, but then that's also going to carry over in many ways to race and gender and so on. It's like you're a victim of exactly kind of what your course is talking about, amongst other things, not just politics, philosophy, science, but also just bombardments of media to reinforce these norms. And so, yes, and that not all people are victims of the same magnitude. So going back to Williams Forson's book and what you're speaking about earlier is that, yes, I mean, if right activists are looking at the Black community's consumption of chicken as being just about hurting chickens, then you've completely missed the point. So yes, it's kind of like, don't at me until you go read that book and come back and realize how the magnitude of victimhood specifically around this symbol far surpasses kind of so many things that you might have had to overcome. And the reason I just even say that, and honestly, it's rare, it's odd that I'd say this, is what I actually gather from the Jain tradition. And what we do here is like, it really stimulates compassion more than anything else, is the recognition of like victimhood across the board. And that engenders a kind of like patience, at least at times, a form of patience and listening, deep listening, which is kind of hard because we find that many activists are just overcome by the urgency and the horrors of the situation, to also simultaneously be compassionate and patient. It's extremely challenging. So I guess on that note, whether it's through what you're looking at, representations in media, or how we understand, say, the symbolism behind food, what would you say? I mean, what are some of the impediments you would say to, say, mainstream advocacy these days or activism? What do you think are kind of even maybe these enduring problems that we see?
Oh boy. I had this conversation a couple of weeks ago because I was talking to Dr. Corey Wren, and she had asked a very similar question. What do you see as like, you know, the things that are standing in our way as like as people who are involved in animal protection or animal liberation? And I told her that I see professionalization as one of the roadblocks or stumbling blocks. Effective altruism, which many people may not know about or understand, but it is a sort of philosophical branch that was inspired by, many people would say inspired by Peter Singer and Will MacAskill at Oxford, and which I personally think is actually a intellectually and morally bankrupt like mode of thinking. Sorry, if you're an effective altruist. But
Well, tell us let's before you go ahead, say what do you mean by professionalization? I don't want to get lost.
Yeah,
And then if you could kind of, when you talk about, even just for a layperson, like effective altruism, just like the general trajectory of that.
Yeah, so like when I talk about professionalization, let me be clear that I'm talking about the fact that when like long ago and far away, when I got into the animal rights movement, bread was a nickel. But like just like we're talking about like sometime about a decade ago, there were a lot of grassroots communities that still kind of existed, that at least I was a part of, and gradually those grassroots communities had been stripped away systematically, I would say, and like subsumed by larger, like sleeker, more professional like organizations. And and it's very easy to like look at this as like, oh wow, we're scaling up, we're becoming more professional, we have like people who are executive directors, and we're building relationships with like key stakeholders and in the food industry, and we're and in politics, and we're making changes, and that's great and everything. But what I'm seeing is just like the consumption of of volunteer bodies into the nonprofit industrial complex, which is largely ineffective, and I think has been roundly evidenced to be ineffective. That's not to say that we can't experience like individual victories, but like you're operating within a machinery that is by default corrupt, and in institutions that like are anti-liberation at their core, and so therefore cannot lead to liberation. You're also hamstrung by the constraints of like these institutions, and yeah, like as these bodies like eat up all of the by like grassroots organizations and monetized in a lot of ways, that hurts the movement. That is a material harm to the movement and to ultimately animals. And I would like to see a resurgence or a reemergence of like grassroots animal rights activism and all forms of activism. There's a book by Vincent Bevins, and I think that it's called like the lost decade of protest, where he talks about mass protest in the 21st century and how it has operated, and its successes, but also its many failures. And I would recommend that as a great read as well. And as far as effective altruism, I think that like the most slimmed down, bastardized version or definition of effective altruism is like, how does one do the most good? Well, these geniuses at Oxford have come up with a calculation to do that. And and largely, as far as I can see, like so many of the conversations around effective altruism are coming up with creative ways how to kill your grandma, because a lot of it is is coming up with these hypothetical situations where if A is happening, but you can actually make more money doing B, then forget about A and do B instead. And I think that I had read in a couple of articles that the running joke around effective altruism is that when one greets another effective altruist, he asks the question how many orphans have you killed today or whatever, because the hypothetical is usually something like, if you see a kid drowning but you're on your way to work and you'll ruin your work shoes by saving the drowning kid, you're doing more good by going to work and earning money and donating it to a better cause rather than rescuing the kid, which is insane. But that's just my reading of it. And and it's supposed to be data-based and research supported. But what it ultimately comes down to is money. What it ultimately comes down to is a variation of capitalism, which is responsible for so many of the ills that we are experiencing today. And I think that effective altruism has been a colossal failure. And yet, over the better part of a decade, people who identify as effective altruists have been installed in various positions of power across the animal rights movement. It was one of the easiest movements for them to get a foothold into, and they are thoroughly entrenched. And I have no patience for it. I have no patience for people who center how much money you earn in order to, quote, do good, and using that as a metric for doing good. And and if you just look a nominal amount of time examining this, it completely falls apart. Just like people have been challenged in the past interviews where it's like, how far are we going to take this idea of doing good? Do you work in a correctional facility, even though you identify as an abolitionist? Okay, if the answer to that is yes, do you work like in the SS? Or do you become a Nazi? Because the paycheck that you earn, you'll be able to redistribute it is an absurdity. It's a complete absurdity. And again, I have no patience for it. Which leads to another thing that I view as a limitation or a stumbling block to the success of animal liberation: elite capture, which is like a theory and a book written by Olufemi Taiwo. And I'm probably butchering that name. My apologies for that too. But it talks about elite capture talks about how movements are very frequently, social movements are captured by people who are part of the elite and systematically dismantled, because these people are controlling not just the social and economic futures of movements, but also these people have deemed themselves to be the creators and distributors of knowledge that that then filtered down to people who previously would have been working in grassroots or are working in grassroots. And so the concepts that we end up working with have been generated by people who are so far removed from the problem and the understanding of the problem, because they have no real world connection to the bodies and persons who are experiencing the problem. Mm-hmm. And so it ultimately just ends up being another form of commodification, and the capturing of of individuals and movements. And all of these are just variations of right-wing extremism, if you ask me. I just said the same thing three different ways. All of this, even when it is dressed up as as progressive, are variations of right-wing neoliberal thought. Mm-hmm. And are in many ways part of the problem that of neoliberalism in movements, and the toxic forces that they promote, and ideologies that they just put out there in the world.
Yes, thank you for that. And I think listening to you describe them, this is many ways things like movements away from grassroots, professionalization, these kinds of strange situations, right, where I should go work at a large bank to make tons of money so that I can redistribute it, because that'll be more impactful than maybe my impact working at that institution. But in no way does it challenge that institution or the systems that actually support those institutions. And then lastly, elite capture, it gives, this is what, I'm not going to say rightly so, I'll just say that it does give, vegan movement and animal movement writ large this kind of bad taste for others, pun intended, I guess, that just reinforces their ability to continue their own habits, which is a shame, right? Which is a shame, because when we look at alternative trajectories, such as desires to erode, dismantle capitalistic structures, because you can't just abolish them, right? You have to be working at some forms of erosion. In many ways, vegan praxis and related animal praxis does exactly that. It aligns with those values, but not if one thinks that those values require one to professionalize or be involved solely in philanthropy and massive donors and so on, which is a shame. I guess that's what I wanted to say is a shame, which is why, yes, I think perhaps this can be the last aspect of what's needed and what can be used. And you already flagged one, which is maybe grassroots, a kind of a resurgence of grassroots movements. And I haven't read Tom Harris's new book. What's it called? Your Neighbor Kills Puppies. And it's about the shack movement and going back to the ways in which you can get kind of local victories. How much, if you want to actually do things that actually do good, think about your community and local victories. And in my mind, that plays into this larger project of changing social norms.
Yes.
And I think this also comes even back to your course, which is about changing social norms inside and outside of media.
Yes. That's it.
So,
you gave the answer. Good job. Thank you.
No. No, wasn't my goal. It kind of helps me wrap my head around it. So, what do you think? for individuals who are listening to this podcast or taking your course in other ways, I think they'll be extremely enlightened. And I'm looking forward to the course and being part of the Q&A sessions. But, what do you think? What would be a path forward for, say, individuals looking to be part of that path forward?
Yeah, that is the answer. I think just like a decentralization, deprofessionalization, a move away from the structures that reproduce hegemony, and moving back towards what we know works. And again, this isn't to say that all nonprofits are created equal. One of the nonprofits that I actually really, really admire is Food Empowerment Project, run by I say run by, but it was founded by Lauren Ornelas, who very recently, I think in the past 24 months, after I believe 15 years of existence, had changed the model of of Food Empowerment Project from a traditional nonprofit hierarchical structure to a collective. And during the entirety of their existence, the campaigns that they have engaged in are not simply solely focused on animal liberation and animal rights, but worker rights and and the working class person as well, farm workers and slaughterhouse workers, and people who are even working for supposedly ethical vegan brands, and exposing the labor abuses that are rife in those organizations. And they've been fighting the good fight. But again, through countless conversations that I've had with people at FEP, that they as many victories and as much as I see them as a model of leadership, there is also this acknowledgement that they're constrained by the structures that within which they're operating. So there is we don't want to talk in absolutes. There's room for talking about how we can make this work as we transition. And I just think that's an excellent model of it. But yeah, I think that it's necessary for us to get away from this deeply impersonal, professionalized structure, a move away from compartmentalization, which again is something that FEP succeeds at, because they're not just focusing on one thing and talking about animal injustice in isolation, how it's related to these larger structures that exist within our food system, and how these abuses and exploitations occur for all bodies, irrespective of species, human or animal. And those are things that I would want to see. And I also want to see a really dedicated approach to documenting and preserving our history in the animal rights movement. And what I mean by that is we're only as good as as the stories that we have that we've seen before. We're only as good as the successes that we have documented before, the people who came before us, the history that existed before us that we can learn from. And I see a lot of people either actively rewriting that history or dismissing it in many ways. But there are great people that are doing the work of trying to preserve it. Carol Adams and Kim Stallwood are two people that that are curating this this amazing archive. Roger Yates continually tries to remind people about the history of veganism and the radical roots that it has. And and that is such important work because it fights against the narrative that we're given from the professionalized class about consumer capitalism and consumerism as tools of, quote, resistance, which are very they are tools, but they're very poor ones. And you're limited by how much money you have in order to make good and ethical choices within the system. And veganism was never about that in its history. Mm-hmm. And as people aggressively try to make it about that and individual consumer choices rather than the structural problems that we face and the persons who have created those structures and benefit from maintaining them, that's a serious problem. And I don't want us to wait until much of our history has either been rewritten or lost to realize how important it was, to realize that the definition of veganism as given to us by the Vegan Society in the 1970s is real, and is valid and is important now. as like, because it was radical and is radical in today. And it's not about like how many Beyond Burgers are on grocery store shelves, which aren't doing great right now, by the way. So like, yeah, like, and again, like just to go back to effective altruism, I see that like all the time. One of the like most popular stories that I see people who are A, professional and B, effective altruist likes to relay is that like, oh, one of the greatest inventions that helped horses was the automobile and like the expansion of the automobile as the primary mode of transportation for people in the early 20th century. And look at how many horses we've saved, which is horse shit. In my opinion, because it's completely ahistorical. This is not a success. Henry Ford, who was virulently anti-Semitic, is responsible largely for the expansion of and proliferation of automobiles. And what do we have today in the United States in particular? Car-dependent cities and structures that isolate people, that like destroy environments, that are ugly, that are not visually stimulating, intellectually stimulating, and like ruining our cities and limiting the types of like, places that we're able to live. And because of the destruction of like, like entire like ecosystems in order to build this like, extraordinarily wasteful and expansive model of living or way of life, we've destroyed all of the like, all of the ecological structures that horses would live in. We didn't save horses. We like, we eliminated wild horses and domesticated the rest of them. And they're living in a multi-billion-dollar a year industry of like, of horse slavery and servitude. And then they're discarded as waste products at the end, and they end up as either like dog food or something worse. That's not saving horses. We didn't save horses. We transformed our lives in a worse way because of capitalism. And it's ridiculous and intellectually dishonest to reimagine this as a victory because we're no longer using horses as our primary mode of transportation. No, we made horses a hobby for rich people. That's not saving anything. And again, I can't overemphasize the fact that you have made our lives materially worse as fossil fuels are like, and the consumption of them to like fuel these automobiles that we're all driving, these 2-ton machines that are incredibly inefficient for transporting people around. It's ridiculous. Like, what? And again, like, preserving our history in the right way would prevent people from trying to rewrite it in a fashion that is sympathetic to like, literal, like racist, anti-Semitic, pro-capitalist, like warmongers. So yeah, and bigots. So yeah, that's what I would say. I know that we're wrapping up now. Like, we've hit.
Well,
like
no,
I mean.
No, it's okay. And we can go forever. I mean, trust me, it's not yours. I could continue to talk forever. I have to keep myself on a kind of a boundary as well. But, I what your comments also conjured in my mind was just how much, with the example of automobiles, we've just completely normalized this notion of like roadkill, as it were. So we've saved all these horses, but we're completely okay, not only with these cars decimating other populations, but is there an even greater sign of, say, human supremacism than just leaving these ungrievable corpses next to our cars? And as we go past them, they're just signs of the stories that we've continually tell ourselves. And so I'm looking forward to, like, I think in your course, regardless of what the topic is, right, is that these are mostly, say, fictional representations of the stories we tell ourselves, whether or not they come across our visual or oral field, like in real life or on the screen, that just reinforce these certain tropes. And yet, like you also said, I think you were referring to Hooks earlier, has the power to subvert that. So as to just maybe I don't want to end just on this awful situation of the horses and other animals in the wake of the combustion engine in automobiles. But I'm really looking forward to students seeing how prevalent these themes are in our media so that they, at the very little, can be critical and maybe work against them in what ways they can.
That's absolutely it. And like, as grim as the horse like anecdote is, like I think that we can like end it on a very positive note, because if there's one thing that we're going to see in this class, it's fun. We're going to have a lot of fun. At least I am. I don't know about the rest of you. Like if you take the class, maybe you won't, but who knows? I personally think that like examining film and critiquing film is like, it's enormous fun. It stretches you like mentally and intellectually and creatively in ways that you hadn't considered before. And I want to emphasize to people that there's no wrong interpretation. This is a great thing about like media theory. Like, you know what? It's like whatever your interpretation is, if you can back it up and you can successfully argue it, it's right. It's right. People absolutely hate that I make vegan analyses of of pop culture, like iconography that exists. They're like, oh, that's not right. That's not the artist's intention. Well, once an artist puts something out there in the world, it doesn't matter what their intentions are. What matters is what meaning you can make of it.
Sure.
And everybody has the capacity to do that. And I want people to dive into that capacity and expand the boundaries of what they think is possible. And I think that there's a lot of room to do that.
Amazing. Looking forward to it. So yes, Christopher Sebastian is teaching veganism in pop culture for us at Arihanta Institute. I highly recommend anyone listening to put that kind of just in their field of curiosity, sign up. I think it'll be a wonderful class. And most importantly, Christopher, thank you so much for being here today on the Engaged Jain Studies podcast. I know, for one, I've had fun.
Good.
I hope you have too.
Yay, it worked. I've had great fun. And thank you so much for having me.
Wonderful. Thank you all. And see you next time.
Thank you for listening to the Engaged Jain Studies podcast, brought to you by Arihanta Institute, an IRC 501c3 nonprofit California corporation. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave us a review on your favorite podcast platform, or better yet, tell a friend and share it with a colleague. At Arihanta Institute, we bridge ancient wisdom with contemporary living through accessible, self-paced online courses, free events, and a first-of-its-kind Master of Arts program in Engaged Jain Studies. Visit arihantainstitute.org to learn how our curriculum spanning Jain philosophy, social justice, veganism, environmental studies, and more can enrich your understanding of timeless principles in today's context. Jai Jinendra.